Okay, Unit 5, Lesson 2 deals with the types of city governments that are out there, how these governments are, how these municipalities or these cities are actually governed. And so we're going to look at the different methods of governing these municipalities, these cities. And so there's a couple of types of city governments. There's two basic forms of city government. There's the council manager form of government, defined as a form of government where voters elect a mayor and a city council, and then the mayor and the city council will appoint a professional administrator to actually do the managing of the city. And then there is the mayor-council form, and there are actually two further variations of this type of government. There's the weak mayor form of government, which is the form of government where the that's supposed to be mayor. I apologize. The mayor shares power with the council and other elected officials, and this is going to be very reminiscent of our plural executive at the state level. And then there's the strong mayor form of government, and it's the form of government where most power rests with the mayor. And so the mayor is actually going to be the individual exercising the administration of the city. And so we're going to start taking a look first at the council manager form of government. And the council manager form of government is actually the most popular form of government in Texas today, and it's going to arise out of the Progressive era in 1901 through 1920, which was a time where there was a lot of concern about corruption and inefficiency of large cities, dominated by what we know as political machines, these political parties that churn out continuous individuals to run a particular city. And so Amarillo will actually be the first city to adopt this type of government in 1913, followed closely by places like Phoenix, Dallas, and San Antonio. Except for Houston, all major cities in Texas use the council manager form of government. And so under this system, voters are going to elect a small city council. And this usually is 7 members, which will include a mayor. So a mayor and 6 individuals. And then, once the city council has been elected, the council will hire what is known as a city manager. And a city manager is an individual who manages the city, just like it sounds. They're the chief administrative officer of the city. They essentially do the day-to-day operations of government in the city. And so they will hire the city manager, and the city manager will then go about running the government, running the city. And the city manager will be the person who appoints and removes major heads of departments of government, and who is responsible for budget preparation and budget execution and things like that. They are really the person that has the hands-on approach of the government. They are essentially the head of government. They would be like the governor of the state, or maybe in this case they would actually be more like the lieutenant governor, who has a lot more power than our governor does. But they carry out and execute management of the city. And so if they do this, what's the point in having a city council and a mayor? Well, the city council and the mayor are in charge of the mission, the policy, the direction of government within the city. More specifically, the mayor and the council, they generate policy, and then all of that policy administration and authority is going to be carried out and rests with the city manager. So they essentially are the board that runs things, kind of like kind of like a school board. You have the school board, they adopt policy, and it's going to be the superintendent that carries things out. And this is the same at the city level. You've got the board who adopts policy, and then the city manager is going to carry out the roles of that policy. And so the council and the mayor dominate the areas of mission and policy, while the city manager dominates the area of administration and management. So they have some differing kind of roles in government. And the mayor and the council powers, they're going to be greatly reduced under this type of government, because the city manager is going to have most of the control of what's going on within city government. And so if you have this, what's the role of a mayor? Because a lot of times we sort of see a mayor as an individual who runs government within a city. And that's not always the case. And so the role of mayor in city governments is typically misunderstood. And the reason for this is because there are many variations of this role within office, depending on the type of government that is in effect in your particular city. But the mayor is going to be the presiding officer of the council, and usually they will get to vote. If they didn't, typically you would only have 6 members and there could be a tie. And some cities will only allow the mayor to vote in the case of a tie, but in a lot of cases the mayor actually gets a vote as well. A small number of cities only a small number of cities utilize that tie-breaking mechanism. So usually the mayor's going to get to vote. They typically do not have a veto power. All major cities in Texas, except El Paso, do not give their mayor the power of a veto. El Paso's a little bit different. And so the mayor becomes the head of state. The mayor becomes the symbolic leader, the embodiment of the city, but it's not the head of government. They're not the ones that carry out day-to-day policy. The council and the mayor only select 4 city officials. The rest of the city officials are going to be selected and appointed by the city manager. They only select the city manager itself, the attorney, the city clerk or the city secretary, and the municipal judge. Pardon me for that, I apologize. But the municipal judge in some cases can be elected by the electorate there within the city. So it's a very symbolic figurehead type of role to be the mayor in this particular form of city government, but they are sort of the face of the city, but they don't really have a whole lot to do with the actual administration of government. Typically, this type of a council is only part-time, and because they are only part-time, and because of our type of political culture here in Texas, they actually receive either a very tiny salary or no salary at all. They do this on a volunteer basis, which can some see this as perhaps a flaw in this type of government if we don't have a professional council, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So conversely, the role of the city manager is they are going to be appointed. So they're not elected. They are appointed by the city council, and they actually serve at the pleasure of the council. And so they can be removed from their position for any reason at any time. And so they serve at the pleasure of the council. And in some cases, you might actually see this position, the city manager, be known as the city administrator. But the duties are essentially the same, and they do serve at the pleasure of the city council. Now, you can't just be, I guess you could be appointed by any average Joe could be appointed to the position, but primarily, city managers aren't just regular average individuals off the street who don't know what they're doing. They are trained professionals. They usually have a master's degree in public administration, and they've probably been a city manager before or an assistant city manager at some point, and they are probably members of city manager groups like the International City Management Association. There's also the Texas City Management Association. So they have professional organizations that create codes of ethics to help promote ideas of professionalism within city government management. And so there is a level of professionalism that is part of our city managers out there. Their role is really to provide information and advice to the council, and they're supposed to do this on a very impartial level. They're supposed to allow the council to have the information that they need to formulate a policy to be in effect to best manage a particular problem or a particular issue within society. And so their job is to be impartial and provide information to the council. They are the chief administrator. They carry out the policies and the ordinances. Anything passed by the council, it is usually their job to carry out these particular policies within the city. But city managers can also, even though they don't formulate policy, they just execute policy. They can sometimes impact policy changes in city government. Sometimes professional managers attempt to provide information that is impartial, so the council can make they sometimes provide information that is partial to a certain policy or a method of dealing with something, and they might try to influence the way or the type of policy that the city council will enact something. And so this is going to lead us into some of the weaknesses of this type of government. As we sort of alluded to earlier, one of the weaknesses is that this type of council are part-timers. They probably, and they do usually, in fact, have regular jobs, and as a result, it's done on a volunteer basis. I mean, you do have to run for election, but you volunteer to run for election. It's not a paid role. And they usually serve a very short amount of time period because it does take up an extraordinary amount of time to be on the city council. Citizens oftentimes, because the city manager is not elected, they feel like they lack influence over what's going on with the city because the city manager has a lot of leeway of instituting certain policies and ordinances, and so they might feel like they lack influence over the city manager, and there might be some voter apathy that occurs as a result. And city managers can oftentimes, as I sort of alluded to earlier, ignore large parts of the community. They are not respondent to the electorate within the city, and so they might focus their attention more on the more affluent regions of the city instead of the less high areas in regards to socioeconomic value. Again, I alluded to this earlier, city managers can also skew and hide information from the council in an effort to control decisions. And so because our city council individuals are typically part-time, they might not have all the time necessary to devote to looking at a specific issue and doing the research themselves, and so they do rely a lot on city managers to provide them with information. And if the city managers do not provide them with the proper information, then it can affect the decisions that they make. All right, so that's the council manager form of government. Now we're going to switch gears and look at the mayor-council types of government. And we said that there were two different types, and so we're going to look at the weak mayor form of government under the mayor-council type. And it says also known as the weak mayor form of government, which is exactly what I have written up here, so just sort of ignore that. But this is the form of government where the mayor shares power with the council and other elected officials there in the city government. And so the mayor is going to have very limited powers in much the same way that the governor of Texas has very limited powers because of the plural executive. They have very limited control over budget formation and execution because there's a person in government whose job it is to do that. The number of terms a mayor can serve is typically going to be limited in this type of government. So they're going to be term limited. There's not going to be the ability for a lot of continuity, and so they can be very limited. They have little or no veto authority. We've already talked about the fact that El Paso is the only large major city that actually provides veto power for a mayor in at the city level. And then there's a strong mayor form of government, and this is probably what we think about when we think about a mayor and the powers that the mayor has. But in this type, the mayor has a lot of power. It's the form of local government where most power rests with this individual. And so the execution of government is not carried out by the city manager, it's going to be carried out by the mayor. And so in this type of government, the mayor can appoint or remove major department heads. When we talk about department heads, you're going to be doing an activity that helps you to understand the different department heads that are put into place to help with city management and city government. But we're talking about attorneys, we're talking about heads the director of public works, sewage, utilities, things like that. They have control over budget formation and execution, so they're going to take on a lot of the roles that the city manager and some of these other department heads might take on in other forms of government. And they are not limited in terms, so there's a lot of power that can be derived from this strong mayor form of government. And they might have some veto power. We know that El Paso is the one that allows for their mayor to have veto power, but while it might not be a specific veto, a official veto, there might be some kind of check and balance that the mayor has over the city council within the city form of government. And many mayor council forms exist in general law cities. And so if we are looking at the different types of cities and the governments that they typically have, we're going to see the mayor council form of government be exercised in the general law cities. And many home rule cities in Texas actually blend a strong and a weak mayoral powers. In Houston, Houston and nearby Pasadena are the two largest home rule cities using the mayor council form. So typically it's going to be a general law city that has a mayor council form, but Houston and Pasadena are going to be exceptions to that rule. Most home rule cities in Texas, like I said, blend strong and weak mayoral powers. The Houston mayor, for example, can appoint and remove department heads and is responsible for budget formation and execution. However, they do not have veto power. They have very short terms in office, which is only 2 years, and they are limited to 3 terms, so they do have term limits. And so you've got this mix of the weak and the strong types of mayor-council governments. Many more mayor-council forms exist in general law cities in Texas than in home rule cities. Formally, however, all have very weak mayors. Their powers are provided in the state statutes, and no form provided in the state law can be classified as a strong executive. And so, anyway, there is another type of government that we do not see on a very large scale, and in fact, there's only one major city in the United States that actually utilizes this type of government, and that's Tulsa, Oklahoma. But it is a type of government that we have seen within Texas at some point in history, and it is the commission form of government, which is defined as a form of local government where voters elect department heads who also serve as members of the city council. It's a very simple form. You have 5 commissioners that are going to be elected. They are heads of departments. They're head of, maybe the budget. They're head of public works. They're head of utilities. They're head of all of these things, and they are subjected to the electorate. And police, fire, street and public property, water, sewer, finance and revenue, parks and buildings. These are going to be the commissioners that are elected by the electorate. And through their positions as heading up these different departments, they sort of cut out the middleman. And they are elected to a citywide vote as a head of a department. And when they are elected to this position, they automatically serve as the city council as well. So they cut out that middleman, and it's a very simple and very efficient form of government. But it's kind of like a parliamentary system in that it mixes the executive and legislative branches, and so we actually do not see like checks and balances and things like that. They don't have to really answer to anybody but the electorate. And so the weaknesses of this form is that voters do not always elect competent administrators. They don't necessarily, anybody can run, but you might not have any particular training in a certain job that you're running for, and so we don't always elect the most competent administrators. And as I said, it does eliminate the separation of powers and checks and balances at the city level, because the only people that they are beholden to are going to be the electorate, and there's no executive or legislative branch. They're just all together in one. There's no real leader, no mayor, and so there's no real face of the city Typically, what happens is they alternate this position between the commissioners over a certain period of time, so that there is a presiding officer. And like I said, Tulsa, Oklahoma is, I think, the last large city that operates under this type of government. So it's not something that we typically see, but it is something we should mention because there are some types of or some cities in Texas that have utilized this over time. At one point in our state history, Galveston utilized this. They abandoned it in the 1950s, but it is something that we have seen. All right, so we're going to stop there. When we come back, we're going to look at elections at the local level, at the municipal level, and we'll continue with this this local government.